Yeah, so my father was telling me that I there wouldn't be much help for me. They didn't really have the means to help me become established in farming or ranching as I would like at that stage, as I would like to have been. And my mother was one of these farm girls who had got a teacher's certificate, and for her academic accomplishment was very important. And so she really pushed all of her kids to do well in school, very much with the agenda in mind that it represented an economic occupational alternative. So we did actually, all of us did very well academically, and this resulted in, eventually I had a good enough high school graduation record that I won a General Motors scholarship to become a chemist. I had a high school teacher who influenced me strongly at the time. He was an excellent teacher, and he was a chemist, and so I thought I'd like to try chemistry. And General Motors saw chemistry probably as a valid discipline. I don't think they would have seen anthropology as a valid discipline. Probably wouldn't have got the scholarship. But it did enable me to have some choice about how I went about my university education. It gave me, of course, I had to work the summers still to make to have enough money to live, but that General Motors scholarship really helped. I think it was the princely sum in those days of $1,500 a year, but that was that wasn't bad for 1969 when I started university at it was then the University of Saskatchewan Regina campus, and it was an amazing place. It's now the University of Regina. It since became its own university. But like a number of universities that were developed in the 1960s, and I'm counting here, for example, Simon Fraser, I guess Sir George Williams, York University, they were beneficiaries of the fallout from the McCarthy years in the United States. There were high caliber academics, especially old left and new left Marxists, but also various kind of maverick types, psychedelic psychologists, for example, who had been drummed out of universities in the U.S. and were hired by these growing universities in Canada. So there was a politically very radical atmosphere around these new campuses. The University of Regina, for example, was a terminus for an underground railway of draft dodgers and deserters in the Vietnam era. One of my friends was a deserter who a political woman in Regina married him to essentially to get his immigration sorted out, and that was there was a circle of leftist women who were actually doing this. They were as a service to the cause of impeding and frustrating the Vietnam War. So there was a lot going on, really fascinating, more fascinating to me than chemistry classes. And partway through my first year at Regina, a friend said, there's this course in something called anthropology. And I think you'd like it. Try it. So I did. And it was taught by a team, actually. There was a guy called Dick Pope, who worked with Kickapoo in mainly Oklahoma, a little bit in northern Mexico as well, and Ken Schramm, who was a psychiatrist by training, but very interested in anthropology. So they co-taught this course, and that's really what hooked me on anthropology. Dick Pope was a humanist, a Quaker, so it was a very kind of qualitative, really narrative-oriented kind of anthropology that he enjoyed. And Ken Schramm was very interested in the sort of the cultural mind. And this was a tiny department of anthropology that was being built by Darcy McNichol. Darcy McNichol had been hired to develop this little department. And he was a member of the Flathead Nation from Montana. But I think on one of his parents, I think it was on his mother's side, she was Prairie Métis and had a connection from Montana up into Saskatchewan and Manitoba through the kind of Cree Métis side of the family. And Darcy was a very interesting guy. He was a novelist. I think he might have been the first Indigenous PhD holder of a PhD in American anthropology. He worked in the New Deal era with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So quite policy-oriented. But he was this very broad mind from kind of from Indian policy to an interest in writing novels. And Darcy was not there long, a few years, and then I think he moved to the Newberry Library in Chicago, and eventually retired to Albuquerque. Darcy offered me an opportunity to follow up my interest in Nakota. So I wrote I didn't do field work for this. I was a lowly undergraduate, but I did a substantial historical essay on Nakota under Darcy's supervision. And not long after, I think I was in my second year, there was a Frenchman hired. He was a student of Marvin Harris, and a recent PhD from Columbia, and like a very serious materialist in the Marvin Harris mold. So there was this really stark juxtaposition between Dick Pope's kind of humanistic hermeneutic kind of approach to anthropology and Jean-Luc's fervent belief that anthropology should be a proper science. So it was an interesting training for an undergraduate. And then there was also Eleanor Smollett, who was a pretty, dyed-in-the-wool, fairly classic Marxist. I guess she would be categorized as old left, maybe. And her husband, Peter, was in the Division of Social Sciences, also at Regina. And there was quite a lot of tension, as you can imagine, not only between the Marvin Harris brand of materialism and Eleanor Smollett's Marxist materialism, but between that classic Marxist view and the First Nations emphasis, or the as it would then have been termed, I guess, Indian studies emphasis that Darcy McNichol was developing in the department, and that Dick Pope and Ken Schramm were interested in. Because the idea was, of course, on the old left that these preoccupations with Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal autonomy, those were distractions from the true proletarian revolution. And what Indigenous people had to understand was that they were, in fact, part of a proletarian or lumpen proletarian social category that had to organize under that banner. It was a very interesting time to be an undergraduate. When I started university at the age of 17, and my mind was sort of just wide open to these things, and I jumped ship at the beginning of my second year. I shifted from chemistry to anthropology as my major, and General Motors didn't cut me off my scholarship, so I completed my degree. I did actually have one fieldwork encounter then on the Carry the Kettle Reserve. Jean-Luc Odkevich encouraged me to undertake a study of kinship, and so we went. Actually, he went with me to the settled part of that reserve, and we met a couple of elders and talked about. Basically, it was a kind of a classic exercise in kinship structure and terminology. I think I probably still have that paper somewhere in a trunk, And so that was my undergraduate degree, and I took a bit of time out after. I had a couple of job experiences that were, I suppose, helped to shape what I eventually did in graduate studies. One more than the other. But the first was, I was hired by the Attorney General's Department in the government of Saskatchewan to how can I put it? I was a messenger who was young enough that I wouldn't be killed off by hostile town councils and rural municipal councils. And I have to explain. That's an enigmatic way of putting it. But at the time, rural Saskatchewan was undergoing a fairly transformative shift in policy having to do with the commitments of the railways to maintain the transportation infrastructure required by farmers. The West was settled on the theory that you had to have a grain delivery point not more than 7 miles from every farm. And so you had your CNR and your CPR, well, first the Canadian Pacific Railway and running through the southern part of the prairie provinces, and then the Canadian National Railway, the CNR, running through the northern, more northerly farming districts. But then there's a web of secondary and tertiary branch lines off of those two main lines to accomplish this miracle of a grain delivery point every 7 miles. And so that's a kind of an interesting overlay. It's more like rivers and streams and tributaries. Not really an overlay, but an underlay to the entirely geometric surveyed sections and quarter sections. The road system on the prairies is you have a road every 2 miles from north to south. You've got an east-west road, and every mile from east to west, you had a road allowance. Of course, a lot of these road allowances fell into disuse, and they were merely survey lines between people's properties eventually. And they had, incidentally, some great ecological benefits because those fringes that farmers couldn't plow up became places for wildflowers, for grouse, for various wildlife. But the story of branch line abandonment was an interesting story, and it was a very politically sensitive topic in the early 1970s because farmers historically had come to think of the rail lines as the means of cheap transportation for their products out and for their goods in. And the CNR and the CPR were tired of maintaining them and had found various ways to talk themselves out of, or to talk the governments out of holding them accountable to maintaining this service. And I was working at the time, it was the government of, Premier was Alan Blakeney. The Attorney General was Roy Romanow. These were significant figures in the history of initially the CCF, the party of Tommy Douglas, but then Alan Blakeney was the next generation of the NDP, and following him, Roy Romanow. And so they were very committed to a kind of agrarian socialist vision, which has deep roots in the kind of communitarian culture of farming, especially in the West. But the writing was on the wall. They were not going to be able to maintain this deal with the railways. And they sent me out to explain partly the policy and what alternatives the government was going to try to provide in terms of trucking and other provisions, and to collect feedback from the leadership of the rural communities. And occasionally I got some heat. I looked like a bit of a hippie. I had, if you can believe it, I had long hair in those days, and quite a bit of hair at one time. And so for socially conservative, politically, there was this tenor of agrarian socialism, but there was also a social conservatism about many of these communities, and so my boss got a bit of complaint about this hippie coming around to, as they perceived me. But my youth saved me from the sort of main aggravation that had my boss or more senior members of the department had this job. They would have gotten attacked. It was that sensitive an issue. That was one job. It was an interesting job. And then I took on a job with the Saskatchewan Museum of Natural History, which, well, it wasn't really with a museum per se, but a project that was headquartered there, the Churchill River Study. There was a hydro project planned for the Churchill River, most of which was never developed. There was some hydro development on the near the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border, but I was hired to do an archaeological survey as a crew member. I wasn't an archaeologist, but I was hired as a crew member along with one of my close friends. We'd been undergraduates together at Regina. Both of us had taken courses with another professor there who came partway through my undergraduate degree that I didn't mention, but George Arthur, who worked on bison ecology on the plains, and I got some archaeological tools through that experience, and went to the Churchill River and hung out for a summer doing archaeological survey. We met some Cree folks from the town of Stanley Mission, two of whom worked with our crew, worked as guides. One of them, there was Michael Roberts and Joe Ratt, and Joe brought his wife and a couple of his kids along, and so it was an interesting, I won't say an immersion in Cree life, but it was a kind of a hybrid camp with Cree knowledge of the land and a certain amount of fishing and hunting going on as part of that household's relationship with us. And it was an exposure is my first exposure to the subarctic and to Western Crees. So I knew that I liked that kind of setting, but it wasn't really where my dreams were in terms of what I originally planned to do for my doctoral or for my graduate work. So I ended up doing master's and PhD studies at McGill. And that's a story that I guess we should continue after a break because we're down to a couple of minutes.